Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Anglo-Turkish Society talk, for choosing to spend your evening or part of your evening with us. We are welcoming Professor Brett Wilson from the Central European University in Vienna, where he is the director of the Center of Eastern Mediterranean Studies. He has also authored Translating the Quran in an Age of Nationalism, Print Culture and Modern Islam in Turkey, and is the editor and translator of Nur Baba, a Sufi novel of late Ottoman Istanbul, which came out last year. And it is on this latter topic we are going to be hearing from him this evening. So if I can ask if during the talk everyone keeps their microphones muted, so the bottom left part of your screen on Zoom, you'll see a microphone. You want to click it so there's a red line through it, and you're muted. You're more than welcome to keep your cameras open if you so desire, but if you choose to both mute yourself and switch off your camera, that can help with any bandwidth issues you may experience running Zoom. This is the tried and tested tips of doing lots of Zoom lectures. And then at the end, when we do the question and answer, I will invite people to unmute themselves and ask their questions to our speaker. So without much further ado, I will hand over to Brett. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I'm very happy to be here with you this evening, and I thank Craig and the Society for the invitation. This is a project I worked on for many years, more than I would like to admit, honestly. Translating a novel and editing it in a way that can make it understandable to readers who maybe aren't so familiar with the context. So I'm delighted to speak with you, and I'm going to talk about the novel, but I'm going to talk just as much about Sufism, the city of Istanbul, and some of the controversies surrounding the novel that really will animate our conversation. So first of all, I'd just like to say a bit about Sufism in the late Ottoman Empire. The novel itself, if you haven't read it, and I'm assuming most of you haven't read it, is about a Sufi lodge on the Bosphorus where a very charismatic yet naughty and manipulative sheikh uses his disciples in various ways to achieve his personal goals. And it's a microcosm of what's wrong in Turkish society in the last years of the Ottoman Empire. And to that end, I'd like to say a bit about the situation in the city. This is a map of all the Sufi lodges throughout Istanbul. You can see that there are quite a lot. In this version, I think there's around 200. Some of them are too close together to see. But it's thought that there were around, at the peak, about 300 Sufi lodges in the capital, and they played a lot of different roles. In neighborhoods, they often provided charity, they often provided community. They were oftentimes places of devotion, but also places of perhaps of artistic training or other types of activities. And so they're really a part of the urban fabric of Istanbul. And their number reached their peak in the late 19th century, the time in which this novel is actually set. Now, I'm going to tell you more later about the particular lodge about which the novel is written, which is far up the Bosphorus, and is one of these lodges on the edge of the city, let's say. It's definitely not in the urban space of downtown Istanbul. There are many different types of lodges, first of all. Some of them are imperial complexes, like the one you see here, which are built of stone, which have domes covered with lead, and which are usually connected to larger entities or küllies. So they would have perhaps, as you see in this example here. At the top, you would have the Sufi lodge, where it says tekke. Then there would be a mosque somewhere on the premises. Here in the middle, you see the jami. And then on this side would be a madrasa, a religious, an Islamic school for training. On the left, you have a graveyard, and oftentimes you'll have institutions like a soup kitchen attached, or a khan, or a hospice where people could stay. So Sufi lodges were very much a part of Ottoman urbanization. And when new cities were founded, usually Sufi lodges were part of the infrastructure. That's evident from Anatolia all the way deep into the Balkans, even into Central Europe, where I live. We can find Sufi lodges in Hungary, for example, and throughout these regions. So just to say that they weren't peripheral institutions in any way, they were very much a part of the Ottoman system. Here would be an example in Istanbul of another grand imperial lodge, a Mevlevi lodge at Yenikapı. And this is an example of a Bektashi lodge in Istanbul, architecturally the most impressive one, called Shahkulu. It has this very interesting room with the pillar in the middle. It's unique. And then you would have a different style of lodge, which resembled the residences of elite Istanbulites. So here you have another Mevlevi lodge, which looks very much like any Bosphorus side mansion, or yalla in Turkish. These types of lodges were often frequently built on the hills and in different neighborhoods. And again, they resemble elite residences more than any particularly institutional form. And sometimes they blended in seamlessly with the neighborhoods around them. And the lodge I'm talking about this evening is one of these types. It is a wooden lodge that looks very much like a house of a wealthy Istanbulite. Now, some general things we can say about Sufism in the late Ottoman Empire. There are many different tarikats, or Sufi orders, which have very different orientations towards toward the religion of Islam, towards Islamic learning, towards music, culture, art. The orders were also financial institutions of a certain sort. They owned many properties, usually in the form of a pious foundation or a wakf. And these wakfs would have things like real estate, agricultural lands, shops, mines, which would fund the operation of the lodge. So the income would support the food and the charity and all the other types of things that the lodge provided. And as I said before, they were closely connected to the state. In the late Ottoman Empire, they were increasingly monitored and controlled by the state in similar ways that any modern state would seek to centralize its authority over institutions. This very much happened in the last decades of the Ottoman Empire. Some orders had political roles or functions that they fulfilled at different times. The Mevlevi order, for example, was very close to certain sultans. They obtained the ritual function of girding the new sultan with a sword, symbolically making him power, the authority. In the late period, Abdulhamid II used certain orders as propaganda tools or organs of his secret service agency. Then we had other lodges which were very much cultural centers, you might say. They taught music, they taught literature, they taught composition. And an example of this would be, for example, the Galata Lodge in Istanbul, which was a famous center for musical training. Now, in the late period, the state created a system of controlling the foundations of the lodges, which made them much more dependent on the state. And an official body was created that actually oversaw the appointment of the leaders of the lodges, oversaw the conditions of the physical building itself. And in general, the Sufi lodges did not like this, as you can imagine. They lost their independence, and increasingly the state, as it needed money for other purposes, tended to seize their properties or to not allow them to receive as much stipend as they needed to actually operate their organizations. And so we see a record of what we might call complaining and declining of the lodges, which is oftentimes blamed on the state's excessive control of their financial institution. Now, to get to the Sufi order that we're talking about this evening, which is the subject of the novel, is the Bektashi Sufi order. And the patron saint of the Bektashis is Haji Bektash Veli. He is buried in central Anatolia, south of Ankara, north of Nevşehir. He has a large tomb and complex, several important shrines for central Anatolian Muslims and Bektashis worldwide. And you have a picture of the complex here, which was drawn in the 19th century. Haji Bektash Veli is a saint for many different groups in Turkey, and has become a larger symbol of Turkish nationalism more broadly. But in this particular context, he is most important as the founding inspiration of the Bektashis, which was a very particular kind of Sufi order in the early Ottoman Empire and the late Ottoman Empire. So what were the Bektashis actually like? What distinguished them as a group? Well, it really emerges within the Ottoman domains as you might call it an Anatolian Balkan interpretation of Islam. It tends to use Turkish language for its rituals. It had a heavy influence from Turkoman tribes in its early days. And it really kind of, in some way, some people have argued that it's the kind of closest thing you might call to a native Ottoman Sufi order that really bears the characteristics of its environment. So it's not an order that used Arabic or Persian and tried to import different cultural forms. It really is something that seems to emerge out of the late Seljuk and early Ottoman context. Now, they had a blend of Islamic beliefs, some of which are shared with Shiism. The discourse about the 12 Imams, about the martyrdom of Hussein, the importance of Karbala as a religious moment. And there are certain esoteric orientations in the Bektashi order, which in the 15th or 16th century were quite normal in Anatolia and the Balkans. But over time, like nowadays, some would describe them as being heterodox beliefs. But actually, it wasn't that heterodox in its own context. In any case, their beliefs and their practices are controversial in, let's say, broader Ottoman and Turkish discourse for some reasons that I'll explain here. But in the early period, let's say in the 15th and 16th and 17th century, there weren't many controversies about the Bektashis. They were really a part of the central Ottoman system and quite close to the Ottoman military and the projects of Ottoman expansion in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And so we don't see attacks on the Bektashis by religious scholars in these periods, but we do see them later for reasons that I'm going to explain quite soon. Now, also their religious practices differed quite substantially from other Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. Bektashis are allowed to drink alcohol, and they have a lot of poetry celebrating that and celebrating their differences and their freedom from certain constraints which other Muslims do not have. Typically, they do not fast for Ramadan, do not pray the 5 daily prayers, but they have different practices. They fast, they have different fasts, they have different types of prayers and devotions they do. And so, again, here, it's really a very different interpretation of Islam, which emerges from its own context. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Janissaries or the Yeniçeriler, the military corps that was very instrumental in Ottoman military power, especially in the early centuries of the empire. In some accounts, in most accounts of the founding of the Janissaries, the myth of Haji Bektash as a patron saint is a very important one. Sometimes the Janissaries are called the sons of Haji Bektash. Not all Janissaries were Bektashis, but there were certain institutional and symbolic links that made them quite close. And this had a big role in what happened to them in the modern period. As I said before, they were both the Janissaries and the Bektashis were very central to the functioning of the Ottoman imperial system. However, all of this changes in the 19th century with the ascension of Mahmud II, who decided in 1826 that the Janissaries were a very troublesome military unit which had used in recent years its power to disrupt Ottoman politics, to control the appointment of sultans, to use their power to challenge the state in various ways to get their way. And so this moment in 1826 is called the auspicious incident, when Mahmud II decides to eliminate the Janissaries by force, by a massive slaughter in Istanbul, which happened. And at the same time that this happens, he also abolishes and legally prohibits the Bektashi Sufi order, as it was seen as a close ally of the Janissaries and a danger to his plans. And this moment is often seen as the beginning of modernization in the late Ottoman Empire, in which the state actually began to destroy what it saw as outdated traditional institutions. And here I just want to emphasize that destroying the Bektashis was also part of that. This meant that for the Bektashis post-1826, that they were officially illegal. They couldn't own properties, operate openly, be Bektashis. And as you see on the right side here, well, I'll get to that in a sec. They were subject to a number of attacks and accusations to which they had never been subject. They were accused by the religious scholars of being heretics, of not being real Muslims, and basically had the kitchen sink thrown at them in terms of religious polemics. And from this point on, there's a kind of hostility and a suspicion towards the religion of the Bektashis. Its properties were given to other Sufi orders, particularly to the Naqshbandi Sufi order. And one interesting thing that happened here, if you look on the right side, this is the Haji Bektash complex again. Mahmud II ordered that there be a mosque built in the center of the complex, which you can see on the right here with the minaret sticking into the air. Now, later on, after Mahmud II fades from the scene, there's a period of revival in which the Bektashis are able to regain some of their properties and to operate covertly or not so covertly in some cases. And there's this period, there's a discourse about them which is referred to, I should say, as the Bektashi secret. And since Bektashis are operating under the table, let's say, there's a lot of secrecy and ambiguity and suspicion around them. And this causes the imaginations of their critics to run wild. What are they doing in these secret ceremonies? Why are they meeting at night? And why are men and women meeting together in these lodges? And this Bektashi secret discourse lasts very much into the Republic. So it lasts at least a century. Now, what's interesting is that because these lodges are somehow peripheral, somehow out of the spotlight, many of them become attractive to elites. They become places where elites can go and have a freer social life. They become centers of elite culture where authors, musicians, poets go to spend time. And we see this trend occurring especially toward the late 19th century in the lodges of Istanbul. Now, the lodge the novel is written about is called by several different names, but you can see here that it's on the Asian side. The Tahir Baba Sufi Lodge, it's called on the map. It's just below, it's on the very large Chamlaja Hill, not very far from the top of it. It would have been a peripheral area of the city in these times, basically surrounded by orchards or woods and not much else. And there's nothing left today of the lodge, unfortunately, except for the graveyard, which is preserved here. And the municipality of Üsküdar built this wall around it about 20 years ago, which was instrumental in saving it from complete loss. But the rest of the wooden structure have completely been lost to the weather and fire and other issues. In the late 19th century, a man named Nuri Baba was the head of the lodge. And it was under his tenure that it became a grand lodge. And that is because many wealthy Istanbulites began to frequent the lodge, became his disciples, and gave large amounts of money to build it into a grand mansion. It's also a time in which the lodge was one of these centers of high culture in the city. And we know of numerous famous people and political leaders who attended the lodge, who socialized there, who became disciples of Nuri Baba. In the novel, the character Nur Baba is initially called Nuri Baba when he's a boy. And then when he becomes older and becomes a man, his name is changed just to Nur Baba. But basically, the author has set the novel back in time to this period of reverie and high culture at his lodge. Now, something else happens in the late 19th century, which is very important. And it's not related so much to the Bektashi order as to all the Sufi orders in the empire. And that is that reformists and Islamic Puritans, as well as modernists, came to see Sufi lodges as dens of perdition, places where unethical activities occurred, where untrue or unsound religious teachings were propagated, where illicit social relations happened, affairs, abuses of sheikhs, of their disciples, as well as financial corruption, obtaining the wealth of the disciples through spiritual authority. And this wasn't particular to the Ottoman Empire in any way. It was a broader trend across the Muslim world in which traditional institutions were criticized by modernists as inhibiting and prohibiting the modernization of society. On the right here, you have a cartoon from the 19 teens in which the Sufi sheikh is depicted as a kind of menacing monster. And this menacing monster image is definitely something that we feel when we look at the novel. This particularly occurs in Istanbul post-1908. And that is because in 1908, after the Young Turk Revolution, there was freedom of the press in a way that there had really never been before in the Ottoman Empire. And it meant that for the first time, people were criticizing Islamic leaders and institutions very publicly and very harshly in newspapers, in journals, in different media. And Sufis were definitely included in this. And we saw a number of intellectuals call for the abolition of Sufi lodges or their drastic reform in order to make them useful institutions for modern society. They're blamed for these things I mentioned before, making people lazy, superstitious, unethical, and so forth. There's a critique of different elements of Sufi institutions, like the master-disciple relation. There's a number of different suggestions and accusations that illicit sexuality is occurring in the lodges, and as I said before, corruption. There's a large push for reform. Now, during this very same period, I'm talking here about the 19 teens, writers of the modernist and nationalist persuasion become very interested in Sufi lodges, and we can include people like Ziya Gökalp, we can include Fuat Köprülü, and here, as you see on the screen, on the left, Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoğlu, the author of the novel Nur Baba, and on the right, Yahya Kemal, the famous poet. Both of these men attended the Tahir Baba of Tamlaca Lodge in Istanbul and became disciples of the sheikh there. And there's different questions about why in particular they did this. But one thing is for sure, they were both fascinated with the idea that in a Bektashi Sufi lodge, you could find survivals of ancient Turkish culture. That the music, the poetry, perhaps also the rituals would give you a window into the soul of the Turkish nation. And this was a kind of romanticism that was very important in Turkish nationalist thought in the period. It's a linguistic nationalism. And the question was, of course, where do you find authentic Turkish culture? And if you looked at Ottoman high culture, most of it was very influenced by Persian forms of culture or Arabic forms of culture. And so the Bektashi order was kind of a unique site which they thought they could excavate to find something that was essentially or quintessentially Turkish. And so we see both of these famous writers going there, spending time, and in Yakup Kadri's case, writing the novel about it afterward. The novel appears first in newspapers, serialized, and then it's published as a book. The serialization of the novel was interrupted because it was quite controversial. And it's only a couple of years later when the book is actually able to be fully published. It seemed to anger many different groups, for different reasons. It angered Bektashis, obviously, who felt that they were portrayed in a very negative light, because in the novel, a manipulative sheikh has sexual relationships with many of the female disciples. He has romances with them, and then at the end of the romance, they give their money to him. And then after obtaining these resources, he moves on to the next wealthy disciple, and in this way, he builds his lodge. So Bektashis were not happy, as one can imagine. Women were also not happy because the lodge tends to portray women in a rather stereotypical and old-fashioned way. This is a time when, in the Young Turk period, the late years of the empire, when women were becoming more public and were moving outside of the house more openly, wearing different kinds of clothes. And one of the themes of the novel is that women who are out of the home and who end up going to places like Sufi lodges become manipulated and become abused and neglect their duties as women. So feminists wrote harsh critiques of the novel. And because of these various disruptions, the government didn't like it very much, but it was a smash hit, and all of the copies were sold out within a couple of months. And then since that time, the novel has never been out of print. Now, I'll discuss a few themes in the novel here, which are quite central, and then we'll move on to the aftermath. So one of the main themes is the decline of the family. And it was a common theme in literature of the time because modernization was changing life in various ways. And of course, it affected the family. I mentioned before the portrayal of women. One of the main definitions that the author gives of what a Bektashi lodge is being an anti-family institution. Because the women fall in love with the Sufi master, then they forget about their families. Some of them leave their families completely. Some of them ruin their families by financially giving all of the money to the sheikh. And some of them leave their children behind simply to spend time with the sheikh. This is a theme that Yaqub Qadri had written about before in his previous novel, which is called Kiralık Konak, or the mansion for rent, in which the great Ottoman families are declining. And they can't afford to live in their mansions anymore. They have to rent them out to make income on them. The novel takes place here, well, part of the novel takes place here on the shore of the Bosphorus in one of the mansions of one of the characters. And the novel focuses almost exclusively on these elite venues. We don't see themes of non-wealthy Ottomans. We see mansions, palaces, we see fancy shops. It's the decline of the family, one of the major themes. Another is the predatory Sufi master. The portrayal of a Bektashi Sufi leader in the novel is that he is basically a predator. He's trying to seize his prey. He's trying to squeeze everything he can out of them, whether it's passion or gratification or actually money. And this is, let's say, the main theme related to the Sufi sheikhs. Now, people have debated whether or not the novel is supposed to be a general attack on Sufi sheikhs. There are other sheikhs mentioned in the novel who aren't so bad as Nur Baba. So he's perhaps portrayed as a particularly terrible one. But in any case, the implication is that Sufi sheikhs are dangerous and it's best to stay away from them. On the left here, we have a picture of the actual leader of the lodge with whom Yaqub Qadri became a disciple. He led the lodge until its closure in 1925. Ali Nutki Baba. Another theme is Westernization and the loss of values. The Westernization theme comes through in several ways. One is that we see these elites frequenting a Sufi lodge are very Westernized. They've spent time in Europe. They have European clothes, and they go in the city only to the European areas, Westernized areas, like as you see in the map here, Beyoğlu. The heroine of the novel, Nigar Hanım, goes several times to Istiklal Caddesi to go shopping in French or British stores. We never see her or other characters go to the bazaar or even to any Muslim neighborhoods of the city. So we see an elite which has lost its cultural identity and has become Westernized and is basically spending its time between their mansions and the European areas of Istanbul. This is a very interesting theme. And the corruption of the women and the family is also implied in this theme as well. There's a certain materialism, a certain lack of depth that goes along with it. Now, one other very important part of the novel is the ancient accusation of orgy, which originates in antiquity surrounding the Bacchanalia cult, the god of wine, to which a important cult emerged, and the Roman Senate banned it and executed thousands of its followers at one point. In any case, Yaqub Qadri uses the orgy accusation in the novel to imply that the Bektashis are a kind of Bacchanalia cult, that they worship wine and sex, and there's not really any Islamic content there. Now, interestingly, he mentioned a lot of different references and figures from antiquity associated with the Bacchanalia. He mentions Dionysus. He mentions the female followers of Bacchus. He mentions many different things which alert the reader to the fact that he sees a kind of Mediterranean decadence built into the DNA of the Bektashi order. And this has emerged and transformed over time into an accusation which is widespread in Turkey, which is that of putting out the candle, or mum söndürmek, familiar with the term, which is traditionally made against the Alevis, or sometimes called Kızılbaş, but also against Bektashis, that in their ceremony, at one point, the candles are put out, and then all the participants in the ceremony have sexual relations, and then when the lights go back on, everything goes back to normal. This is also connected to an accusation of incest and the idea that Alevis and Bektashis don't know their lineage because they might have been born as the products of these rituals. So this libel has really no connection with reality, but we see different versions of it from antiquity, transforming in medieval Islamic history, in the Ottoman Empire against the Kızılbaş, and then the Bektashi. And then with this novel, we see something very interesting in that this kind of ancient libel is transformed into modern literature. And in that way, it has a metamorphosis into something new. There's also the theme in the novel that Bektashi rituals and songs and poetry are national culture. And this is one of the key interests of Turkish nationalists in the Bektashi Sufi order. And so despite the fact that this novel is really harsh and critical of the Sufi lodge, at the same time, it adores their music, it adores their poetry. It sees in them a kind of window to the soul of the Turkish nation. And interestingly, this idea has survived into the Turkish Republic to the extent that Hacı Bektaş has become a national figure, a national hero, who is lauded as a kind of Turkish genius or philosopher, and whose tomb, as you see on the left, has become a national museum and has been broadcast on postage stamps and tourism campaigns and all kinds of things. So we have this very interesting tension between a harshly critical portrait of a Sufi order and kind of adoration for their value for the nation and its culture. Interestingly, a film was made of the novel just a year or two after the initial publication. It was called Secrets of the Bosphorus, Boğaziçi Esrarı. And it was also another scandal. The film opened, but then was forced to close for several months and then was only able to be viewed later. Interestingly, none of the actresses were Turkish in the film. They had to use non-Muslim and Russian actresses. We see here a couple of images from the film. On the left is Nigar Hanım, heroine. On the right is Nur Baba. This is an advertisement in a newspaper which announces that the great Russian actress Madame Sarmatov will be playing the role of Nigar Hanım. And this is one of the very first Turkish films. It's not the first, but it's one of the first. And so we see that this depiction and portrayal of a Sufi lodge has a very important and founding element to it, that early Turkish national culture was heavily involved in a critique of religion, in a portrayal of a certain kind of debauchery and corruption, which played a big role in the move for the state to harshly reform religion in a way that really eliminated most traditional institutions to make way for Republican culture and institutions. Now, after all of this, we're talking about the 20s here, the Republic is founded, and then we have in February and March 1925, a major revolt in Eastern Anatolia. And it's led by some Kurdish chieftains who also happen to be Naqshbandi Sufi leaders. And as a result of this revolt, the state takes the opportunity then to abolish not only the Naqshbandi Sufi order, but all Sufi orders. And in 1925, we see here the New York Times reporting the Turkish parliament has officially suppressed all of the Sufi lodges in the country. This meant that, as you see here on the left, almost 800 lodges were closed and almost 1,000 mausoleums and tombs of Sufi masters were shut. We saw a very harsh campaign in the media to portray the Sufi lodges as dens of perdition or houses of indolence and laziness. Here we see a cartoon where Haji Karagos are telling these Sufi dervishes, go out into the world and do some work and live a bit. Stop being monastic. The law transferred all the properties of the Sufi orders to the Ministry of Foundations, and only the sections that were functional as mosques could stay open. So we saw those images before of the complexes. So the complexes remained partially open, but the Sufi sections usually fell into quite a bit of disrepair. All Sufi positions and titles were banned. Any ceremonies were defined as being illegal. And as I said before, they were closed. I won't go into that. We then saw the confiscation also of all the possessions and objects that were in these Sufi lodges. And here are just a few Bektashi objects that ended up in Turkish museums. On the left, you have the traditional headgear of the Bektashi leaders. In the middle, an axe with some poetry. On the right side, you see a begging bowl, which is an ubiquitous object in Turkish museums that have Sufi objects. But again, I just want to emphasize that despite the fact that the objects are prohibited for use, they are seen as very valuable for national culture. This is the same leader I showed you earlier, after 1925. The leader of the Çamlıca Lodge, Ali Nutki, had an interesting dinner with Ataturk and discussed the novel with him. And Ataturk seemed to like Ali Nutki Baba and then appointed him to a position as a bureaucrat in the local government, very close to the tomb complex of Hacı Bektaş Veli. And so we see that despite these controversies, in some ways, Bektashi leaders still managed to be on the favorable side of the state and even managed to obtain careers there after the abolition of the lodges. However, we can also say that Nur Baba and other novels established a kind of pattern of representation that determined how Sufi leaders were seen. Here on the left is another novel, one of many, where you can see an elegant modern Sufi sheikh is surrounded by beautiful women, and this theme of the Sufi leader as a playboy is quite prevalent in the early Republican culture, and to some extent, even today. I'm going to wrap up now with a few parting thoughts. And one is that Nur Baba sets the tone for thinking about, for portraying, for representing Sufism, Sufi leaders, and in Sufi lodges in national culture. We have many copycat books which look like Nur Baba and sound like Nur Baba. And some of the assumptions that come along with it have become deeply ingrained in Turkish society. It marks a very interesting cultural moment in which these traditional institutions, which had been part of the neighborhood, which had been part of everyday life, really take on a completely different meaning and aspect. And they go from being cornerstones of the neighborhood to being dangerous places that are, abusive, corrupt, unethical, etc. As I suggested before, we see this transformation of some long-standing biases, like the orgy accusation, translated in an interesting way into national culture and literature. And I think probably the most insidious result is that because Nur Baba and other forms of modern culture did this transformation, they tended to reinforce and deepen some of these biases against Alevi Bektashis, which we've heard in recent years also voiced by the president of Turkey, we have dictionaries written in the 70s and 80s, which define, you use the word incest to explain who Alevis are, things that draw on very long-standing. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Brett. There's a lot to get your teeth into there, a lot to think about. So yes, we can use our clap reactions, we can applaud on camera, we can do all kinds of stuff. But that was very interesting. And I'm going to open the floor to questions. If anyone has any, just use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can drop them into the chat as well. While people are still thinking, I think they're just blown away by the sheer amount of information that they've taken in right now. I'm going to abuse chair's privilege and ask one of my own. I was very happy to hear about the focus on Bektashiism in this novel. As someone who I worked on the Janissaries for my PhD, so sort of that Bektashi connection's there. And when you talk about the novel reflecting kind of contemporary fears about Sufism and that it's kind of not, morally right, and that it's something that should be avoided. I'm just wondering, the fact that Bektashiism was chosen in the novel, how much of that do we think is sort of mud that stuck to the Bektashis kind of like post 1826 after that auspicious event, would you say?
So how much of the criticism is post 1826, or?
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking about the because the Janissaries obviously were abolished in 1826. I'm just wondering how
Sure.
long that kind of like, negative perception of we can make the Bektashis the corrupt, the villains, how much of that was kind of like mud that stuck through their association, their prior associations per se.
Oh, sure. That's a great question. I think a lot of it, honestly. Um, it's an interesting kind of thing. So we see in like 1860s and 70s several kind of exposés written by members of the ulama about the Bektashis, saying they're not real Muslims. They've always been, fake Muslims.
Are they
Um,
crypto Christians? Yeah, all the
mhm.
suspicions. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that gets so there's this idea of religious difference, but that becomes compounded in the 1880s and 90s with this idea that they're places of elite entertainment.
Mm.
And we can find this also in like archival documents and things where the state is sending spies to see what's happening in these lodges, and are there women there? Are they drinking alcohol? They're asking these kind of questions. So the secret element, the idea that they're secret because they, were also suppressed like the Janissaries, it's really important. And I don't know, it's also kind of urban legend, urban enjoyment of
The idea that these lodges became a kind of like ancient Greek symposium kind of, dining club drinking party kind of place. That's
absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've got a question in the chat from Anthony, who asks, is it true that Ataturk at one point considered making Bektashiism the state religion? Was
Oh,
that ever?
I've heard this rumor before. Um, I don't think so.
Mm,
Um, it's so of course one interesting dilemma of the early republic is that many of these Sufi orders helped in the War of Independence.
mm,
They were instrumental in organizing people and using their properties and mobilizing, and many of them were visited by Ataturk, including the Bektashis. He stopped in the Hacı Bektaş complex
mm.
1920 and visited and so on. Um, and because of that, a lot of Sufi orders want to say Ataturk supported us. Ataturk was one of us in some sense. Uh, um, but of course, in 1925, they all get abolished. And
Mm,
some of these orders that were closer to him, like the Mevlevis, the Bektashis, say like, well, couldn't you let us stay open? Could you let us keep our properties? But he says, sorry, I can't do anything. So I don't think he wanted to make any religion official. And I suspect that that's more of a way of Bektashis trying to say that Ataturk liked us, and we're loyal Turkish.
there is that popular photograph of him going to a costume party as a Janissary with the famous Bektashi headdress. I'm sure you've seen that photo as well.
Sure,
Um,
sure,
yeah,
absolutely.
no, is that I mean, it's easy to see why Bektashiism with this more kind of liberal approach to Islam would be more appealing to, well, to soldiers, to young men, because soldiers are soldiers, but also to, if we think about the recruitment and the makeup of the Janissaries, to, boys being recruited from, the Eastern European and sort of other parts of the empire, I think it made the transition sort of a little less intimidating to them. So, no, definitely, a very, very important sort of Sufi order right down history. No more questions. I kind of would like to ask you a little bit about, because it's a novel, it's a work of fiction, it's popular culture, it's been made into movies and things like that. I'm very interested in how history is represented in popular culture, whether it has a kind of educational value, how if we can see sort of historiographical parallels in it based on sort of the time the novels or movies are created and things like that.
Mhm.
I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of popular culture as a vehicle for history.
Mhm. Yeah, so one interesting thing about this novel is that it's not set in the time when Yakub Kadri was actually going to the lodge.
Hmm.
It's set in the Hamidian period, that is, during the reign of Abdul Hamid II.
Hmm.
So it was it was distanced somehow from the present, and of course for that time period after 1908, anything associated with Abdul Hamid II is really bad. That was the period of despotism before the revolution happened, um,
I
and
see.
and these lodges as escapism venues for elites becomes popular in that time precisely in the Hamidian period. Um, and so I think Yaqub Qadri was speaking to this through popular culture, right? He wanted to check the boxes that yes, Abdul Hamid II was bad, and people coped with it by going to these Sufi lodges, but in doing so, uh, they also lost some of their values. And very clearly, um, he wanted to make a commentary on the present, right? He wanted to say, um, there's one popular idea that literary modernism in Turkey is really all about advocating for modernization, right?
Mm,
Supporting the project of radical reform. And I think that in this case, it probably makes sense. I mean, we see one of these examples of what are described as declining institutions or decaying institutions. And so clearly, it was a comment on the state of affairs of the day, and it probably wasn't that popular of a comment. I mean, I think for most people, Sufi lodges were what they were,
mm.
but for elites, they started to have this sinister connotation as being anti-modern, anti-progress.
I see. It's also kind of like useful, I think, for people to have the plausible deniability of, well, I wrote a novel, it's fiction, I don't know what you're reading into it, but if you think I'm criticizing you, oh,
That's
okay,
precisely what he did, by the way.
yeah, yeah, this is fiction. I don't, I wasn't. talking about you till no, I do definitely see that quite a bit. We've got a couple more questions in the chat. Mina was asking how strong was the Bektashi order in the Balkan regions?
Yes, it was quite strong, quite strong. Um, Especially in Ottoman Hungary. For example, there's still a lodge that exists in Budapest, the Gulbaba Lodge, and yeah, the Bektashi order was very strong in the Balkans. Albania, what's now Macedonia, northern Greece, Ali Pasha in the western side of Greece, heavily patronized the Bektashis. So it was particularly attractive to, as Gemma was saying, to converts to Islam, because it allowed them to maintain certain aspects of their culture, like drinking alcohol. Um, it there's a concept in Bektashi theology of a trinity of God and Muhammad and Ali, which resonates somewhat with Christian ideas. And so Bektashism was very popular, and the heaviest, still today, the heaviest concentration of Bektashi lodges and disciples is Albania. And Albania currently has the world headquarters of the Bektashi, which was established after Turkey abolished Sufi orders. So most of the leadership fled Turkey and went to Albania, which had always been a heavy center of Bektashism. We also see Bektashi lodges in places like Cairo. Um, there's still a famous lodge there, and another center of elite culture. Um, I think Balkans is probably the one of the heaviest concentrations, maybe the heaviest concentration. Istanbul had 7 or 8 Bektashi lodges, but Albania has dozens, and many of them are kind of like monasteries on hills. Um, we see in Anatolia, we also have several major complexes.
Okay. Another question from Anthony asking a little bit more about life in the lodges. So do people come and go? Were they resident there? You know,
Mhm.
you've just said they can be like monasteries where there permanent people there teaching, your novices. How did sort of the day-to-day work?
That's a great question. I mean, there's often this conversation in religious studies that, can you really compare Sufi lodges with monasteries?
Mm.
And I think the answer is yes and no. So to the extent that yes, in Bektashism, there is a form of membership in which you are a celibate uh, dervish who lives in the lodge full time. This is called mujered in Turkish. So this would be you don't have children, etc. You just serve the lodge as a aesthetic, so to speak. Um, this would this would be a kind of minority, though, right? This would be the core dedicated faithful. Many more people would have just visited lodges, maybe once a week, maybe once a season, maybe for festivals, these kind of things. Um, Maybe something more like we think of as attending a church or a synagogue from time to time. Um, so you had the core, who was a kind of initiated celibate group, and usually the leaders were like this, right? Um, but there's an interesting division among Bektashis, which exists till today. In that, one group believes that Haji Bektash was married and had children, and they claim to be the descendants of Haji Bektash. This is called the Çelebi in Turkish. So the Çelebi live still in Haji Bektash village, and they were traditionally responsible with taking care of pilgrims and taking care of the tomb complex. The other group of Bektashis says, no, Haji Bektash never had children. He was a celibate ascetic, And because of that, we too, as his disciples, we are celibate ascetics. And these two groups have a tension between each other and coexist. Um, but the Albanian leadership is of the celibate orientation.
Mhm.
And then the Chelebi group living at Haji Bektash village uh, is uh, is the lineage based family based. So and these groups, yeah, they don't get along very well, as you can imagine. A lot of fighting over authority and so
You think your family has tense Christmas dinners? Well,
on.
uh, Nezzy's dropped an interesting comment into the chat, kind of touching on what I was saying about sort of the plausible deniability of a fiction, saying rumor has it Ataturk was disappointed by the Bektashi sheikh, and he told this to Yakub Kadri, who was present in the meeting. This man does not match your portrayal. Yakub Kadri replied his character was just fictional, which yeah, you can do that when it's a novel, right? And then when the Bektashis raided the shooting of the film, Kemal Film changed its title to Boğaziçi Mystery. The film was banned by the Allied forces anyway to avoid possible unrest. So I really think that speaks to sort of the strength of the sort of Sufi Bektashi legacy, would you say, right?
Yes, this first story about Ataturk is really, it's a little bit of a confusing one because there's one version which is written by one of the musicians who was in the room at the time. And
Hmm.
there's another version that's written by a Bektashi doctor who was there. And they're very different. But yes, you're right that in both cases, um, Ataturk had higher expectations for the Sufi sheikh of being incredibly charismatic and dynamic, and he was something more of a normal person, more of a maybe a good person even than appeared in the novel. But Yakub Kadri did this repeatedly. I mean, uh, when people wrote the critiques in the newspapers, he said the same thing. He said, "Oh, it's a work of art. That's all it is." Then in the 1970s, he wrote a memoir and he gave an interview in which he said, someone asked him, how was it joining this Bektashi lodge? And he said, I don't have to tell you anything. All you have to do is read Nur Baba, and you'll know exactly what it was like, right? So he has these really conflicting accounts of whether it was very accurate or it was just art. Um, and we're all kind of left somewhere in the middle. But it was certainly inspired by his experience there. Um, One interesting thing he did say is that yes, Ali Nutki Baba was was different than the character Nur Baba. He was only the same in that he was uneducated and that he had a weakness for women. So,
Okay.
so he had all of his bad traits, basically, none of the good ones.
Uh, One more question from Anthony from the chat. Should one differentiate between Alevis and Bektashis?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I think the answer for me is yes. Now, what's happened is that uh, in the 20th century, let's say I would say even from the 19 post 1950, this term Alevi Bektashi as a joint term has become very common in Turkey. Um, Now, historically, the Bektashis were a group in which you had to be initiated, that anyone could join theoretically, right? Didn't matter where you're from, who your father was, etc. Whereas historically, Alavis have been a lineage-based group. You're born Alavi because your family is a member of a certain, what they call Ocak, is a member of a certain lineage, um, which has long-standing ties with certain Alavi leaders who claim to be descendants of Haji Bektash. And all of them being somehow under the umbrella of the Chelebi who live at Haji Bektash village. So Um, Institutionally, these were different groups. Now they converged on Hajj Bektash as an important site and as an important saint for their traditions. And they I think they share a lot of affinity with each other in terms of beliefs, in terms of orientation, but I don't think they can be easily conflated. Um, Now, you could argue that these days in Turkey, after all these transformations have happened, that maybe there's something more like Alevi Bektashi culture, which is um, a blend of kind of national culture with Alevi Bektashi themes. But I think in most cases, you would find that people have a pretty different idea about that. Um,
So, do you think there was ever actually any sort of like crossover on the Venn diagram that some people who were maybe born Alevi went and sort of joined Bektashiism, or is it just a sort of a kind of hypothetical conceptual kind of joining per se?
I think in the early decades and century, there's probably a lot of fluidity.
Mm.
It's probably a lot of mixing and crossing and so on. Um, but I think as you get into like 18th, 19th century, there start to be some institutional divisions. Um, like for example, I mean, in in Anatolia, it would have been very uncommon, almost impossible, for a Sunni to marry an Alevi um, in many contexts because
Mhm.
the social groups were so different. Um, and I think that you know perhaps these intersections of the Bektashi order with the Alevi could allow some crossing over of that. But I think we shouldn't underestimate these social divisions as well, in some extent. Um, so nowadays, if you talk about the Bektashi order, there's an official hierarchy, and uh, some of them are linked with Albania, some of them with leaders in Turkey. But they don't, I mean, they don't overlap much with Alevi Ojaks in Anatolia, which also I have to say, I mean, in the last 40, 50 years, the Alevi lineages have been meaning less and less, and they have less and less authority. So it's a really dynamically changing tradition as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we've run out of questions. I don't see any raised hands or anything else in the chat. So I think we'll probably look to wrap up and we will release you. We will thank you very much for your time. So thank you very much for coming to talk to us. And everyone go out and read the book. And if you'd like to sort of unmute yourselves or use a clap reaction or something, we'll thank our speaker once again. So thank you.
Thanks
Bravo.
a lot. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope it was enjoyable.
It was very fascinating. I'm sure we've all learned a lot. So hopefully we'll be hearing more from you and we can go. Oh, someone's saying where can one buy the book?
Yeah, it's on Amazon or from it's there's an ebook. And the printed version, I have to say, is ridiculously expensive. Don't buy it right now.
As academic publications I want to
Wait,
be, but
wait for the paperback. Wait for the paperback.
can you just remind us
But
who's your publisher? We can keep an eye on that.
it's Routledge,
It's with
Routledge
Rutledge.
publisher in the
Okay.
UK. Yeah. And if anyone really wants it, just write me an email and I'm happy to share a PDF of the proofs with you.
Someone's got the paperback is coming. Charity's very, very excited about this.
Yeah, it will come. It will come. I don't know the exact date, but the book just came out less than a year ago. So I think it will come
Mm.
out maybe 6 months later or 7 months later.
Right, so we'll keep our eyes peeled, and that is with Routledge, so we can keep ourselves abreast of that. So thank you once again. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I will bid you a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.